Lolo Enki TV.
The Law of One, Book 2, Session 35. March 6, 1981. Ra, I am Ra. I greet you in the love and in the light of the One Infinite Creator. We communicate now. Questioner, I would like to say that we consider it a great privilege to be doing this work, and we hope that we will be questioning in the direction that will be of value to the readers of this material. I thought that in this session it might be helpful to inspect the effect of the rays of different well-known figures in history to aid in understanding how the catalyst of the illusion creates spiritual growth. I was making a list that I thought we might use to hit the high points on the workings of the catalysts on these individuals, starting with the one we know as Franklin D. Roosevelt. Could you say something about that entity? Ra, I am Ra. It is to be noted that in discussing those who are well known among your peoples, there is the possibility that information may be seen to be specific to one entity, whereas in actuality the great design of experience is much the same for each entity. It is with this in mind that we would discuss the experiential forces which offered catalyst to an individual. It is further to be noted that in the case of those entities lately incarnate, much distortion may have taken place in regard to misinformation and misinterpretation of an entity's thoughts or behaviors. We shall now proceed to, shall we say, speak of the basic parameters of the one known as Franklin. When any entity comes into third density incarnation, each of its energy centers is potentiated but must be activated by the self-using experience. The one known as Franklin developed very quickly up through red, orange, yellow, and green, and began to work in the blue ray energy center at a tender age, as you would say. This rapid growth was due, firstly, to previous achievements in the activation of the rays, secondly, to the relative comfort and leisure of its early existence, thirdly, due to the strong desire upon the part of the entity to progress. This entity mated with an entity whose blue-ray vibrations were of a strength more than equal to its own, thus acquiring catalyst for further growth in that area that was to persist throughout the incarnation. This entity had some difficulty with continued green ray activity due to the excessive energy which was put into the activities regarding other selves in the distortion towards acquiring power. This was to have its toll upon the physical vehicle, as you may call it. The limitation of the non-movement of a portion of the physical vehicle opened once again, for this entity, the opportunity for concentration upon the more, shall we say, universal or idealistic aspects of power, that is, the non-abusive use of power. Thus at the outset of a bellicose action this entity had lost some positive polarity due to excessive use of the orange and yellow ray energies at the expense of green and blue ray energies. Then had regained the polarity due to the catalytic effects of a painful limitation upon the physical complex. This entity was not of a bellicose nature, but rather during the conflict continued to vibrate in green ray, working with the blue ray energies. The entity who was the one known as Franklin's teacher also functioned greatly during this period as blue ray activator, not only for its mate but also in a more universal expression. This entity polarized continuously in a positive fashion in the universal sense, while, in a less universal sense, developing a pattern of what may be called karma. This karma having to do with inharmonious relationship distortions with the mate teacher. Questioner, two things I would like to clear up. First, then Franklin's teacher was his wife? Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner, secondly, did Franklin place the physical limitation on his body himself? Ra, I am Ra. This is partially correct. The basic guidelines for the lessons and purposes of incarnation had been carefully set forth before incarnation by the mind-body-spirit complex totality. If the one known as Franklin had avoided the excessive enjoyment of or attachment to the competitiveness which may be seen to be inherent in the processes of its occupation, this entity would not have had the limitation. However, the desire to serve and to grow was strong in this programming, and when the opportunities began to cease due to these distortions towards love of power, the entity's limiting factor was activated. Questioner, I would now like to ask for the same type of information with respect to Adolf Hitler. You have given a little of this already. It is not necessary for you to recover what you have already given. Could you complete that information? Ra, I am Ra. In speaking of the one you call Adolf, we have some difficulty due to the intense amount of confusion present in this entity's life patterns, as well as the great confusion which greets any discussion of this entity. Here we see an example of one who, in attempting activation of the highest rays of energy while lacking the green ray key, canceled itself out as far as polarization either towards positive or negative. This entity was basically negative. However, its confusion was such that the personality disintegrated, thus leaving the mind-body-spirit complex unharvestable and much in need of healing. This entity followed the pattern of negative polarization which suggests the elite and the enslaved, this being seen by the entity to be of unhelpful nature for the societal structure. However, in drifting from the conscious polarization into what you may call a twilight world where dream took the place of events in your space-time continuum, this entity failed in its attempt to serve the Creator in an unharvestable degree along the path of service to self. Thus we see the so-called insanity which may often arise when an entity attempts to polarize more quickly than experience may be integrated. We have advised and suggested caution and patience in previous communications and do so again, using this entity as an example of the over-hasty opening of polarization without due attention to the synthesized and integrated mind-body-spirit complex. To know yourself is to have the foundation upon firm ground. Questioner: thank you. That is an important example, I believe. I was wondering if any of those who were subordinate to Adolf at that time were able to polarize in a harvestable nature on the negative path? Ra, I am Ra. We can speak only of two entities who may be harvestable in a negative sense, others still being in the physical incarnation, one known to you as Herman, the other known, as it preferred to be called, Himmler. Questioner: thank you. Earlier we discussed Abraham Lincoln as a rather unique case. Is it possible for you to tell us why the fourth density being used Abraham Lincoln's body, what its orientation was, and when this took place with respect to the activities that were occurring in our society at that time? Ra, I am Ra. This is possible. Questioner: would it be of value for the reader to know this in your estimation? Ra, I am Ra. You must shape your queries according to your discernment. Questioner: well, in that case I would like to know the motivation for this use of Abraham Lincoln's body at the time. Ra, I am Ra. This shall be the last full query of this session as we find the instrument quite low in vital energies. The one known as Abraham had an extreme difficulty in many ways and, due to physical, mental, and spiritual pain, was weary of life but without the orientation to self-destruction. In your time, 1853, this entity was contacted in sleep by a fourth density being. This being was concerned with the battles between the forces of light and the forces of darkness which had been waged in fourth density for many of your years. This entity accepted the honor duty of completing the one known as Abraham's karmic patterns, and the one known as Abraham discovered that this entity would attempt those things which the one known as Abraham desired to do but felt it could not. Thus the exchange was made. The entity, Abraham, was taken to a plane of suspension until the cessation of its physical vehicle, much as though we of Ra would arrange with this instrument to remain in the vehicle, come out of the trance state, and function as this instrument, leaving this instrument's mind and spirit complex in its suspended state. The planetary energies at this time were at what seemed to this entity to be at a critical point, for that which you know as freedom had gained an acceptance as a possibility among many peoples. This entity saw the work done by those beginning the democratic concept of freedom, as you call it, in danger of being abridged or abrogated by the rising belief and use of the principle of the enslavement of entities. This is a negative concept of a fairly serious nature in your density. This entity, therefore, went forward into what it saw as the battle for the light, for healing of a rupture in the concept of freedom. This entity did not gain or lose karma by these activities due to its detachment from any outcome. Its attitude throughout was one of service to others, more especially to the downtrodden or enslaved. The polarity of the individual was somewhat, but not severely, lessened by the cumulative feelings and thought forms which were created due to large numbers of entities leaving the physical plane due to trauma of battle. May we ask if this is the information you requested or if we may supply any further information? Questioner: I will ask any further questions during the next working period, which should occur in about 4 days. We do not want to overtire the instrument. I will only ask if there is anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable or to improve the contact. I am Ra. All is well. I leave you, my friends, in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. The Law of One, Book 2, Session 36. March 10, 1981. Ra, I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. We communicate now. Questioner: in previous communications you have spoken of the mind-body-spirit complex totality. Would you please give us a definition of the mind-body-spirit complex totality? Ra, I am Ra. There is a dimension in which time does not have sway. In this dimension, the mind-body-spirit in its eternal dance of the present may be seen in totality. And before the mind-body-spirit complex, which then becomes a part of the social memory complex, is willingly absorbed into the allness of the one creator, the entity knows itself in its totality. This mind-body-spirit complex totality functions as, shall we say, a resource for what you perhaps would call the higher self. The higher self, in turn, is a resource for examining the distillations of third density experience and programming further experience. This is also true of densities 4, 5, and 6, with the mind-body-spirit complex totality coming into consciousness in the course of 7th density. Questioner: then would the mind-body-spirit complex totality be responsible for programming changes in catalyst during a third density experience of the mind-body-spirit complex so that the proper catalyst would be added, shall we say, as conditions for the complex change during third density experience? Ra, I am Ra. This is incorrect. The higher self, as you call it, that is, that self which exists with full understanding of the accumulation of experiences of the entity, aids the entity in achieving healing of the experiences which have not been learned properly and assists, as you have indicated, in further life experience programming, as you may call it. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is that which may be called upon by the higher self aspect, just as the mind-body-spirit complex calls upon the higher self. In the one case, you have a structured situation within the space-time continuum, with the higher self having available to it the totality of experiences which have been collected by an entity in a very firm grasp of the lessons to be learned in this density. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is as the shifting sands and is in some part a collection of parallel developments of the same entity. This information is made available to the higher self aspect. This aspect may then use these projected probability-possibility vortices in order to better aid in what you would call future life programming. Questioner: out of the Seth material we have a statement in which Seth says that each entity here on Earth is one part of or aspect of a higher self or oversoul which has many aspects or parts in many dimensions, all of which learn lessons which allow the higher self to progress in a balanced manner. Am I to understand from this that there are many experiences similar to the one which we experience in the third density which are governed by a single higher self? Ra, I am Ra. The correctness of this statement is variable. The more in balance an entity becomes, the less the possibility-probability vortices may need to be explored in parallel experiences. Questioner: do I understand from this then that the higher self or oversoul may break down into numerous units if the experiences require to what we would call simultaneously experience different types of catalysts and then oversee these experiences? Ra, I am Ra. This is a statement we cannot say to be correct or incorrect due to the confusions of what you call time. True simultaneity is available only when all things are seen to be occurring at once. This overshadows the concept of which you speak. The concept of various parts of the being living experiences of varying natures simultaneously is not precisely accurate due to your understanding that this would indicate that this was occurring with true simultaneity. This is not the case. The cases from universe to universe and parallel existences can then be programmed by the higher self, given the information available from the mind-body-spirit complex totality regarding the probability-possibility vortices at any crux. Questioner: could you give an example of how this programming by the higher self would then bring about education through parallel experiences? Ra, I am Ra. Perhaps the simplest example of this apparent simultaneity of existence of two selves, which are in truth one self at the same time-space, is this: the oversoul, as you call it, or higher self, seems to exist simultaneously with the mind-body-spirit complex which it aids. This is not actually simultaneous, for the higher self is moving to the mind-body-spirit complex as needed from a position in development of the entity which would be considered in the future of this entity. Questioner: then the higher self operates from the future as we understand things. In other words, my higher self would operate from what I consider to be my future? Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. From the standpoint of your space-time, this is correct. Questioner: in that case my higher self would have a very large advantage in knowing what was needed, since it would know, as far as I am concerned, what was going to happen. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is incorrect, in that this would be an abrogation of free will. The higher self aspect is aware of the lessons learned through the sixth density. The progress rate is fairly well understood. The choices which must be made to achieve the higher self as it is are in the provenance of the mind-body-spirit complex itself. Thus the higher self is like the map in which the destination is known. The roads are very well known, these roads being designed by intelligent infinity working through intelligent energy. However, the higher self aspect can program only for the lessons and certain predisposing limitations if it wishes. The remainder is completely the free choice of each entity. There is the perfect balance between the known and the unknown. Questioner: I'm sorry for having so much trouble with these concepts, but they are very difficult, I am sure, to translate into our understanding and language. Some of my questions may be rather ridiculous, but does this higher self have some type of vehicle like our physical vehicle? Does it have a bodily complex? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. The higher self is of a certain advancement within sixth density going into the seventh. After the seventh has been well entered, the mind-body-spirit complex becomes so totally a mind-body-spirit complex totality that it begins to gather spiritual mass and approach the octave density. Thus the looking backwards is finished at that point. Questioner: is the higher self of every entity of a sixth density nature? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. This is an honor duty of self to self as one approaches seventh density. Questioner: let me be sure that I understand this then. We have spoken of certain particular individuals. For instance, we were speaking of George Patton in a previous communication. Then his higher self at the time of his incarnation here as George Patton about 40 years ago was of sixth density? Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. We make note at this time that each entity has several beings upon which to call for inner support. Any of these may be taken by an entity to be the mind-body-spirit complex totality. However, this is not the case. The mind-body-spirit complex totality is a nebulous collection of all that may occur held in understanding. The higher self itself a projection or a manifestation of mind-body-spirit complex totality which then may communicate with the mind-body-spirit during the discarnate part of a cycle of rebirth or during the incarnation. May communicate if the proper pathways or channels through the roots of mind are opened. Questioner: these channels would then be opened by meditation, and I am assuming that the intense polarization would help in this. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is partially correct. Intense polarization does not necessarily develop, in the mind-body-spirit complex, the will or need to contact the oversoul. Each path of life experience is unique. However, given the polarization, the will is greatly enhanced and vice versa. Questioner: let me take as an example the one that you said was called Himmler. We are assuming from this that his higher self was of the sixth density, and it was stated that Himmler had selected the negative path. Would his higher self then dwell in a sixth density negative type of situation? Can you expand on this concept? Ra, I am Ra. There are no negative beings which have attained the oversoul manifestation, which is the honor duty of the mind-body-spirit complex totality, of late sixth density as you would term it in your time measurements. These negatively oriented mind-body-spirit complexes have a difficulty which to our knowledge has never been overcome, for after fifth density graduation wisdom is available but must be matched with an equal amount of love. This love light is very, very difficult to achieve in unity when following the negative path and during the earlier part of the sixth density. Society complexes of the negative orientation will choose to release the potential and leap into the sixth density positive. Therefore, the oversoul which makes its understanding available to all who are ready for such aid is towards the positive. However, the free will of the individual is paramount, and any guidance given by the higher self may be seen in either the positive or negative polarity depending upon the choice of a mind-body-spirit complex. Questioner: then using Himmler as an example, was his higher self at the time he was incarnate in the 1940s a sixth density positively oriented higher self? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: was Himmler in any way in contact with his higher self at that time when he was incarnate during the 1940s? Ra, I am Ra. We remind you that the negative path is one of separation. What is the first separation? The self from the self. The one known as Himmler did not choose to use its abilities of will and polarization to seek guidance from any source but its conscious drives, self-chosen in the life experience and nourished by previous biases created in other life experiences. Questioner: well then let's say that when Himmler reaches sixth density negative, would he realize that his higher self was positively oriented and for that reason make the jump from negative to positive orientation? Ra, I am Ra. This is incorrect. The sixth density negative entity is extremely wise. It observes the spiritual entropy occurring due to the lack of ability to express the unity of sixth density. Thus, loving the Creator and realizing at some point that the Creator is not only self but other self is self, This entity consciously chooses an instantaneous energy reorientation so that it may continue its evolution. Questioner: then the sixth density entity who has reached that point in positive orientation may choose to become what we call a wanderer and move back. I am wondering if this ever occurs with a negatively oriented sixth density entity? Do any ever move back as wanderers? Ra, I am Ra. Once the negatively polarized entity has reached a certain point in the wisdom density, it becomes extremely unlikely that it will choose to risk the forgetting. For this polarization is not selfless but selfish, and with wisdom realizes the jeopardy of such wandering. Occasionally a sixth density negative becomes a wanderer in an effort to continue to polarize towards the negative. This is extremely unusual. Questioner: then what is the mechanism that this unusual sixth density entity would wish to gain to polarize more negatively through wandering? Ra, I am Ra. The wanderer has the potential of greatly accelerating the density once it comes in its progress in evolution. This is due to the intensive life experiences and opportunities of the third density. Thusly, the positively oriented wanderer chooses to hazard the danger of the forgetting in order to be of service to others by radiating love of others. If the forgetting is penetrated, the amount of catalyst in third density will polarize the wanderer with much greater efficiency than shall be expected in the higher and more harmonious densities. Similarly, the negatively oriented wanderer dares to hazard the forgetting in order that it might accelerate its progress in evolution in its own density by serving itself in third density by offering to other selves the opportunity to hear the information having to do with negative polarization. Questioner: are there any examples of sixth density negatively polarized wanderers in our historical past? Ra, I am Ra. This information could be harmful. We withhold it. Please attempt to view the entities about you as part of the Creator. We can explain no further. Questioner: it is very difficult at times for us to get more than a small percentage of understanding of some of these concepts because of our limitation of awareness. But I think that some meditation on the information from today will help us in formulating some questions about these concepts. Ra, I am Ra. May we ask for any brief queries before we leave this instrument? Questioner: I'll just ask one short one before we close. Can you tell me what percentage of the wanderers on Earth today have been successful in penetrating the memory block and have become aware of who they are? And finally, is there anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable or to improve the contact? Ra, I am Ra. We can approximate the percentage of those penetrating intelligently their status. This is between 8.5% and 9.75%. There is a larger percentile group of those who have a fairly well-defined, shall we say, symptomology indicating to them that they are not of this, shall we say, insanity. This amounts to a bit over 50% of the remainder. Nearly 1/3 of the remainder are aware that something about them is different, so you see there are many gradations of awakening to the knowledge of being a wanderer. We may add that it is to the middle and first of these groups that this information will, shall we say, make sense. This instrument is well. The resting place is somewhat deleterious in its effect upon the comfort of the dorsal side of this instrument's physical vehicle. We have mentioned this before. You are conscientious. We leave you now, my friends. I am Ra. I leave you in the love and in the light of the infinite Creator. Go forth, then, rejoicing merrily in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai.